On today's World Insight, as the world comes to grips with a new political reality in Afghanistan, what will it take for the Taliban to transition from insurgency to governing? And following the deadly attack near the Kabul Airport, we look at the options the U.S. has in evacuating its citizens and allies from Afghanistan. And U.S. Vice President Harris visits Singapore and Vietnam. Is the U.S. pivoting away from the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Twin explosions outside the Kabul airport have rocked the city. The U.S. and Afghan casualties projected to rise. ISKP has claimed the responsibility for the attacks. It has been more than 1 week since Taliban took control of Afghanistan. After the U.S. hasty exit, countries in the West are scrambling to evacuate their citizens and local staffs from Kabul. The Taliban has vowed to form, quote, an open, inclusive government. How will the international community respond in the long term? What can China do to ensure the regional peace? And what can all parties in the region do to fight against terrorism? On that, I have a series of interviews with parties concerned. First up, Hu Shisheng, director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, share his insights. On the latest, I'm joined by Hu Shisheng, director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Mr. Hu, good to see you. As the Chinese expert who is following Afghanistan situation very closely, let me follow up on the latest situation. Your latest response to what's happening with the terrorist attack.
Islamic State Khorasan province now has claimed the deadly attacks. This deadly attack shows that the situation in this transitional period of Afghanistan is very, very dangerous, very dangerous. The deadly attack has showed that the ISIS or ISKP is still very active in Afghanistan. Although this terrorist groups had been military attacked in the past nearly 6 years, because this ISKP was founded in Afghanistan, was founded in July 2015. After that, this terrorist groups had been attacked by nearly all the forces in Afghanistan, including Afghan Taliban, including Afghan government national security forces, including American troops, even sometimes the Pakistan troops launch attacks against those terrorist groups. The ISKP was originally located in one of the provinces bordering with Pakistan called Nangarhar province. Now they have been totally removed from that province. They're scattering in the whole country. So they, of course, they want to seek chances to revenge against all the attackers in the past who had caused their disperse their characters.
Right.
So now the Kabul International Airport is one of the chaotic situations. So the chaotic situation has provided them golden chances to launch this kind of revenge. So their targets first, of course, is the American soldiers or any Afghan who provide or helped American soldiers or foreign troops in Afghanistan.
Let's look at some of the points here. Mr. Hu, we noticed 2 points they attacked. One is near the gate of the airport. The other is at the Baron Hotel, which is the hotel many Afghans, Americans, British, and whoever wants to leave from Kabul going to the airport will need to stay before they head to the airport. You can tell these two places are very targeted, and actually the terrorists knew what's happening and knew all the details of the arrangement leading up to anyone leaving from the Kabul airport. So on that, tell me more about your assessment of the capability of these terrorist groups and also the current plan, both by the Taliban and the U.S. side, safeguarding the airport.
This kind of chaotic situation is quite easy for terrorist groups, such kind, especially such a deadly and experienced veteran terrorist groups like ISIS, ISKP. They can easily find the how can I say the loopholes. That is not so difficult for them to find the place that the targets. These two places are under the severe or rigid safeguard of the U.S. troops. So, of course, it is the U.S. troops' full responsibility to take charge of the security. But this kind of attack, I think that will help the American and the Afghan Taliban in the future coming together to formulate a certain kind of tactics, how to safeguarding this kind of retreat or pulling out. We know that yesterday or the day before yesterday, the head of CIA has flew to Kabul to have a dialogue with Afghan Taliban. They also want the guarantee or promise or commitment from Afghan Taliban there to safeguard the surroundings.
The U.S. President Biden, in response to the terrorist attack near the airport, said that the U.S. will remember this, U.S. will not forget, and the U.S. will hunt them down, meaning the terrorist groups down. But it seems very interesting whether it has the capabilities and the know-how and the strategy and the cooperation to be able to do that.
Since they are pulling out from all the bases within Afghanistan and failed up to today to build new bases in neighbors surrounding Afghanistan. So I'm personally suspicious, doubting whether Biden administration can find a target and then can, how can I say, can launch very accurate attacks against their targets. Very difficult from the ships, from the bases in the Gulf region, very difficult. I think in the future they need the close, considerate cooperation from Afghan Taliban. So this will give Afghan Taliban some leverage to asking for more assistance.
On the other hand, Mr. Hu, we see the promises from the Taliban as well. According to their Qatar so-called peace agreement with the American and with the American alone, that they are going to be cooperating in terms of the withdrawal of the U.S. In fact, they have said that they are in the airport trying to safeguard the people who are to leave. Well, at the same time, they also promised to the international community that Afghanistan will not be used as a place for any terror and terrorist groups to attack others from. Now, it seems that promise is already broken at this moment.
After the August 15th, the headache started. How to run this country, how to pacify the panics among all the Afghanistans, how to restart the government works, how to restart the economic activities. There are still some anti-Taliban military movements in Panjshir Valley. So all things are gushed into one place and require the Afghan Taliban to make decisions as quick as possible. I think it is a big challenge, but whether the Afghan Taliban can stand up this kind of challenge, overcome the current difficulties, it is really a big question. It doesn't mean that Taliban will not maintain their commitment.
People can say, Well, if you don't have the capability, you do not dare to make those promises. If those promises are made, not being met, they're called empty promises.
This is also one of the maybe a positive point that Afghan Taliban can get from the deadly terrorist attack, that we need international community support, all kinds of support, so that we can addressing more challenging tasks.
One of the things is whether the Taliban will be able to separate itself from all the other terrorists, whether recognized or not by the international community, as some argue that they have been growing up their capacity together with those, and they have quite interesting interactions over the history of Taliban.
First of all, Afghan Taliban is not a typical terrorist group. We call it a rebellion. Even the Americans call it a kind of rebellion forces or anti-government forces. We know that there are about 20 around regional and international terrorist groups still hidden in Afghan Taliban. ISKP is an exception because ISKP is the enemy of Afghan Taliban. Afghan Taliban fight against ISP, sometimes even jointly with Afghan government troops, even with US troops, sometimes coordinating with Pakistan troops. So they are targeting against ISKP, but with many other terrorist groups like the Uzbek Islamic movement, like the ETIM, even like Al-Qaeda, they still have some linkage. Sometimes very difficult to seed their linkages or delink the relation with them, because on the ground, they are interlinked with each other. They're fighting with each other. They even marry with each other, take good care of their families with each other. So very difficult. Even the top commanding officials of Afghan Taliban issue order that we have to delink, we have to decoupling, we have to seed or cut off the relations with those terrorist groups. But how the local commanders, the local Afghan Taliban can cut off their relations with their relatives, with their neighbors, with their roommates, with their fighters, friends. So very difficult. It will need some time. But this, of course, will erode the confidence of the international community on Afghan Taliban.
All right.
It will, it will damage the Afghan Taliban image in the international community. Afghan Taliban, the top leaders have to address this kind of issues, but still, let's be a little patient with Afghan Taliban.
Mr. Hu, besides being patient, there are a lot of things that needs to be handled, because people are wondering, after August the 31st, which is the deadline, the Americans promised to the Taliban to withdraw from Afghanistan. What's going to be the mechanism to fight against terrorism in the region? Earlier, U.S. there, 20 years. Whether successful or not, that's another question. But it established its own mechanism together with the forces there, a system fighting against terrorism. Now, August 31st after, what's going to happen? There's a vacuum.
The first responsibility, of course, will be loaded upon Afghan Taliban itself. If Afghan Taliban want the international community to accept it, to financing this regime, it has to take determined activities of anti-terror policies to drive them away or flush them outside of Afghanistan territory. It is their priority of priorities. But we have to face in the ground realities. But if the Afghan Taliban lack the capacity, but sometimes the local Afghan Taliban commanders even lack the willing, what can the outsiders do? Especially those who are facing the spillover threat from those terrorist groups, what they will do. Currently, we have some regional mechanism like that China, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We have dialogues. We have anti-terror cooperation in the past. But of course, it is with the former, we can say, the former Afghanistan government. Now, of course, it will be Afghan Talib-led government. I think that Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi already sent this kind of message to Mullah Brother, who led the delegation to China, to Tianjin by the end of last month, that we want Afghan Talib's commitment in fight against ATIM. And Afghan Talib leader promised this. So even then, so maybe in the future, China, Afghan Talib can carry the bilateral, even trilateral with Pakistan. And we still, in the past, we have some mechanism, quadrilateral mechanism, like among China, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. So in the future, we can even restore it. Even before the new government come into office, the three parties, China, Pakistan, Tajikistan, can still working together closely to save, to cement our borders. So in this regard, I can say China, Russia, Tajikistan can also cooperate. I noticed that 2 days back that President Putin had called President Xi. They're talking about the situation in Afghanistan. Of course, they talk about how to help the Afghan to sailing through the current transitional turmoils, and of course about jointly fight against terrorism. So we have this kind of cooperation bilaterally, trilaterally, quadrilaterally. Even we have SCO. Even within FCO framework, we have Afghanistan liaison, this kind of working mechanisms. We can use this platform to unite all the neighbors of Afghanistan to try to do our respective efforts to fight against the terrorists. Of course, fighting against terrorism should be coincided, or should be accompanying with financial support, with humanitarian assistance. I think that there will be a humanitarian crisis is emerging from the horizon. We have to take actions as quick as possible. Of course, UN is also a framework. UN can also call the emergent meetings to addressing this kind of situation.
Hu Shisheng, Director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies from China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Thank you so much, sir, at this critical time for your insights and expertise. Really appreciate it. Hu Shisheng, the China expert on Afghanistan. Next, more voices and analysis on last bombing at Kabul Airport. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Surab Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute of China-American Studies in Beijing, Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies with Beijing Language and Culture University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. How would you respond to the latest, Mr. Gupta? 13 American soldiers died and many more injured.
It is one of the dirty secrets which has not been talked about, that in the last 2 or 3 years, the Taliban has actually been a shadow ally of the United States in hunting down IS, in providing battleground intelligence to US forces to hunt down IS, Islamic State, that is in Afghanistan. And even while the Taliban were fighting the Afghan army, now is the time when the Taliban are in a position to impose themselves, at least in Kabul, to have that coordination with them so that the withdrawal can be more orderly. And secondly, to do away with artificial deadlines and timelines, August 31st
I see.
or even 9th for that withdrawal. Do as long as it takes to move people out safely and to stem the panic in Afghanistan right now.
Two bombs exploded at different places of the airport. Now, it is known that the airport now is guarded both by the United States, NATO, and also the Taliban forces. The question really is, who should be responsible for this?
Oh, I think it's the NATO forces and the US side. They have responsibility for that area. It's just in that huge crush and of population crush wanting to get out, it's perhaps not easy to create that containment zone. And this sort of incident has happened and will occur. And there's real dangers too, because the US is now trying to extract certain people even from beyond the airport area. And that can create a sort of miscommunication even with Taliban forces. So, I mean, we are not in a good situation in this regard, and it's purely to do with the hasty withdrawal. It did not have to happen this fast.
There were already messages coming from the US side suggesting there might be danger, there might be terror in the airport area. But we can see still a lot of people are there because they're desperate to leave. So, Mr. Gupta, how do you see the fact that the intelligence could get there, but the realities are a totally different story?
On the ground, the situation is almost uncontrollable. And in this situation, you can have good intelligence, and at the same time, that intelligence is not implementable on the ground. And the US just has to understand that. And that is because of the panic that a lot of the Afghan citizens themselves feel that if they don't get shipped out at this moment, they will never get shipped out at a later point of time. And that the US has projected the sense that it's just looking after its own interests. So it creates that much more desire to be there at the airport and be out. And that's why I keep emphasizing, if they can have some sort of a constructive arrangement with the Taliban, it can help stem the panic among Afghan citizens themselves. Don't have to be at the airport tomorrow itself, and that this process can happen in a more orderly way.
U.S. President Joe Biden once again promised that U.S. will withdraw before August the 31st. And meanwhile, he said that the U.S. will not forget and will hunt you down. He's talking, of course, of the terrorists responsible for the bombing in the airport. But Mr. Gupta, how much capability U.S. will be able to fulfill these two promises?
I'd say neither of the two. August 31st, I don't think is doable. And I think that's an artificial deadline put by Mr. Biden so that he can be certain that they will all be out by September 11th. So on September 11th, he can tell the country on the 20th anniversary that we are out. But that's all fine and good, but not at the expense of what is happening in Kabul in terms of human life and in Afghanistan. And I don't think, with regard to the second point, it's helpful even talking about how we will exact revenge and vengeance on these ugly terrorists. There are more important matters to deal with, which is about protecting and safeguarding life and doing that in an orderly way. It's at a later point we can think about going after the terrorists, and to do that, he needs a regional strategy. And it's not just the Lone Ranger approach that he hopes or intends to parlay. I don't think that will work.
I think that this Kabul withdrawal reflect a much bigger issue. That is, United States as a government, as a state, has been in the wrong direction. We do not see any good execution. We do not see good communication coordination among different government agencies. We see people act on their own, like the headless. I think this is not a failure of Joe Biden administration. This is a failure of the entire US government in coordinating such a big event. And this is, like I said, bound to happen. You have 7,000 troops crowded in a very narrow areas without any cooperation of local authorities. There's no local governments. And you just cannot control the situation with thousands of people in that area. You said, okay, American citizens don't go to airport. If you don't want them to go to airport, where do you want them to go? They have to leave the country as soon as possible because the deadline is coming. And also, everything in the planning turned out to be wrong. They hope that the so-called Afghan government will continue. collapse immediately. Not the case. They hope that the 30 or the 300,000 men strong so-called Afghan army, well equipped by American arms, weapons, or trained by Americans, will push back the Taliban. Turned out not the case. They did not consult with any member countries of NATO, their allies. They don't talk to the international communities. They just think that if we withdraw the serious troops, everything will come to equal. That's a fairy tale. That's entirely bad, very poor execution. That reflects United States as a number one power. Really have to reflect on itself. Why things went so wrong? After 20 years, the number one fighting power on earth in the area, and everything goes back to square one and even worse. And now in the entire world, in front of the entire world, United States is putting up a very bad show.
Right.
And if they don't have situation under control, they change the strategy, things like that will happen again. I really, really worry. This is terrible.
I remember President Biden a few days ago when he's talking about why withdrawal from Afghanistan, such a hasty thing. He's trying to describe we've been there 20 years, the U.S., not for rebuilding, not for building regional democracy. We're there to make sure that America will not be attacked by terrorists and terrorist organizations. But even before the deadline, this is already happening, and this is the biggest casualty of the day for American presence in Afghanistan over the past 20 years almost.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And it also tells us about the lack of political will and political bravery in trying to resolve issues like the Afghan issue. Here's the point what I would like to make, and that is that this war was lost, I would submit, at least 10 years back, or it had at least petered out into a draw. The US could not be there indefinitely. It needed to find an arrangement, a successor arrangement, that would involve the Taliban in some capacity along with the Afghan government. But the United States and this has been a perennial problem, it's too politically hard, and we are the imperial superpower, and we don't condescend and have negotiations with dirty people, the Taliban. And because there was, I would submit, 5 or even 7 years back, no arrangements made to have a successor administration in Kabul, that had to be done in haste over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And in that process, the United States did it the sequenced it the wrong way, where withdrawal was premised first and the intra-Afghan political arrangement was sequenced later. That never came about because those forces was that basis on which to do it. So hard decisions need to be taken early because they create a certain path dependence, which then comes to haunt you later. And this is what has happened today.
Huang Jing, Surab Gupta, stay with us. We'll have more discussion on the latest trip of U.S. Vice President to Southeast Asia. You're watching World Insight. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has just ended her 5-day trip to Singapore and Vietnam yesterday, the second foreign trip since she took office. It's meant to bolster U.S. ties with its key allies in Southeast Asia, and some argue to counter China's influence in the region. Harris called the Indo-Pacific critically important to the nation's security and prosperity, and criticized Beijing's activities in the region as, quote, coercion and intimidation. However, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin hit back by rebuting the U.S. hasty exit in Afghanistan, saying the action shows the U.S. jeopardized credibility among its allies. Here's what he said, quote, the U.S. can wantonly smear, suppress, coerce, and bully other countries for the sake of America first without paying any price. It always tries to defend its selfishness and bullying and hegemonic actions by citing rules and order. But how many people would actually buy it? End of quote. You can see the exchange of rhetorics from both sides. So how to interpret Harris' visit to Singapore and Vietnam, deteriorating U.S.-China ties, Let's loop in our panelists once again. For U.S. Vice President Harris' trip to Singapore and Vietnam, in Washington, Surab Gupta, who is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. In Beijing, Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies from Beijing Language and Culture University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. How much impact will the VP's visit to the two countries have on the two's policies toward the U.S. and toward China? Mr. Gupta.
The US has been missing in Southeast Asia, and even Mr. Biden has not spoken to the leaders of Southeast Asian nations. So by having the defense secretary there, having Ms. Harris out there, it projects a certain degree of commitment and reassurance to US Southeast Asia relations. And this is important, and this has to be done by every administration. And the Trump administration did not do so. So I think this is a welcome visit.
A welcome visit to what extent, Professor Huang, your perspective?
United States are way behind, for example, countries like China or even Japan in terms of economic exchanges. Ever since Obama administration, United States has not paid much attention to ASEAN, which actually is very important. A single visit by Ms. Harris will not make it up. Number two, I think the United States has realized relationship with ASEAN member countries is not even. It's actually selective. For example, United States does not have a very good relationship with countries like Myanmar, the other, Indonesia, or Malaysia. It just emphasized on your allies like Philippines, or the new friends like Vietnam, or quasi-allies of Singapore were not enough to make up the shortage in the relationship between the United States and ASEAN. Last but not the least, talk about respect. We know that Ms. Harris just visited the kind of memorial place to memorize Senator John McCain, but that shows America's ignorance as well as arrogance. Ignorance is that memorial was built to memorize, not John McCain, but memorize hundreds, if not thousands, Vietnamese killed by American bombers. And John McCain was just one of them that killed hundreds of Hanoi people in 22 flights. And number two, is that if that's the case, you go there to memorize John McCain, that's an insult. And especially on the birthday of anti-American hero, General Vo Nguyen Gap. And I think that, I don't know who is her advisor. This is a very bad move. Shows that the kind of ignorance and actually arrogance of the United States. I think all of that in details tells us this visit, of course, is very important, but I do not believe it can achieve what it wishes for.
Mr. Gupta, on that specific incident, there were a lot of coverage in the international press. And in China, too, people are watching it and saying, what's going on there? What about, the sensitivity of the issue, the lives lost in Vietnam during the war? Does the American VP feel aware of that?
Unfortunately, it is for the most part internal politics, because she would not have chosen to go about her actions in the way that she did if she was a little bit more thoughtful. I understand Defense Secretary was there, and the Defense Secretary is talking about all the Agent Orange issues, and that's been a perennial issue. But Vietnam has suffered a lot. And considering that what we are seeing today in Kabul reminds us about Vietnam and what the Americans did in terms of the bombings and potential war crimes also, there is an active war crimes inquiry happening with regard to what happened by coalition forces in Afghanistan. And then having this complete dismissive attitude for its own rulers whom it was supporting in these states, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, there is a real tone deafness to American policy in that regard. I read both Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's speech, I have Kamala Harris's speech, and frankly, these could have been read out by Joe Biden and by Ash Carter in 2016. And suppose I did not know who the author was, I might have guessed it was that. So if we are seeing a certain reversion to a more stable American approach to Southeast Asia, I think that is something everybody in the Indo-Pacific would be relatively happy about.
Professor Huang, on that point, we see not only details like this, there are many other bigger issues that whether the U.S. has clarified with countries that the VP visited, for example, in Singapore, for example, in Vietnam. How is the U.S. going to deal with China?
I think that, yes, I think the VP Harris visit in Singapore and Vietnam missed a big point. Several of them. Number one, that the entire ASEAN as an international organization and its member countries has repeatedly emphasized that they don't want to take side in the US-China competition, number one. Number two, they want to promote further economic integration because it's essential for the regional economic development, and also want to maintain stability despite territory dispute in the South China Sea area. And number three, they don't want to be enemy of China. In other words, China is very important, not only for regional stability and peace, but also for regional economic development. As a matter of fact, the entire region, including South China Sea, has been quite peaceful and stable and prosperous in the past 10 years without much kind of so-called intervention or involvement of the United States.
Mr. Gupta, that's a very interesting question because we have seen over the past half a year, different administration officials from the Biden administration going to Southeast Asia. And it seems that it's the same message being delivered, how bad China is, how coercive China has acted, and therefore please with us, Indo-Pacific, under the American strategy. But the question really is, why would those messages being repeated if they haven't worked earlier?
Yeah, my response to that would be that United States policy is so wedded on some of these points with regard to the South China Sea and with regard to larger competition with China, including competition with regard to things like the Belt and Road investments in China, that the United States feels that it needs to at least touch on these as talking points to at least suggest that it is not departing or moving away from that policy stance. So they try to maintain that policy stance as a foundation. What they do need is a correlation of forces within ASEAN leaning more towards the US, because ASEAN is the balancing power in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think they get that much, but they are so wedded to those talking points that begins to alarm. Of course, it alarms China, but it alarms most of the Southeast countries that their grievances are being commandeered by the US to serve US interests and not their development interests. And the US needs to find a way around this. And that will take time, unfortunately.
Following what you have just said, also touch on China. If the US is not persuasive enough to the neighbors in the Asia Pacific, what about China, Mr. Gupta?
Yeah, from the US perspective, the US perspective on China is that, yes, China's military, economic, and diplomatic influence is increasing, but not all of that is increasing in a positive way. And that creates a lot of insecurity and anxieties among the peers, especially because they have these outstanding maritime rights and even sovereignty disputes that are outstanding. The sense that China is seen as a little bit of a bully in the neighborhood is widespread in America, and that's why that talk continually of how they're going to resist China's law breaking, et cetera, which is exaggerated, of course. But that's the reason that narrative is put forth. And I think in that, on those lines, it would be good to see real progress on that code of conduct, because it will be a deliverable which can be shown to one and all that there is real progress on a very contested issue.
Professor Huang.
I think that China and the countries in the region have to understand, including China, the entire region has been developing very fast. Development means change. In other words, there are a lot of challenges created or brought about by all those changes. So China itself should be patient first. And those issues like territory dispute and so on and so forth will be there for us for a long time. But for one point, China has to emphasize, that is, China is for peace. I don't think China wants any persuasive power. China doesn't want to persuade anyone. China wants to talk with each one, consult and communicate and coordinate with everyone in terms of development and security as equal members. China itself will serve China's interest to maintain a peaceful environment, just like everybody else. China should tell others, we all want peace and stability. We all want development. So therefore, let's work together.
It's a very resourceful discussion both of you gentlemen just did. Thank you so much for your contribution. Surab Gupta, Huang Jing, thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.